The boat rocked gently as Rebecca stared at the endless blue horizon. 3 years. That's how long she'd been running from what happened in the lab that day. 3 years of changing jobs, moving cities, avoiding anyone who knew her past. And now, here she was, heading to the most remote place she could find. She was a marine biologist once, a good one. But after the accident, after losing her research partner in a dive that went wrong, she couldn't face the ocean anymore, couldn't face herself. Everyone said it wasn't her fault. The equipment failed. It could have happened to anyone. But their words didn't stop the nightmares or the guilt that sat like a stone in her chest. This assignment was supposed to be different. A simple coral documentation project on a tiny island in the Philippines. No team, no partners. Just her, the ocean, and maybe some peace. The local boat captain had warned her that the weather could turn quickly this time of year. But she didn't care. Isolation was exactly what she needed. Captain Rodriguez, a weathered man in his 60s, kept glancing at the sky as they traveled. "We should turn back," he said for the third time that afternoon. "Radio says storm coming." Rebecca checked her waterproof bags, making sure her equipment was secure. "We're already halfway there. I'll be fine once we reach the island," but she was wrong, dead wrong. The sky changed color in minutes, going from bright blue to an ugly greenish gray. The wind picked up so fast that Rebecca barely had time to grab the railing. Waves that had been gentle swells suddenly grew into moving walls of water. The boat pitched violently, and she heard Captain Rodriguez shouting something in Tagalog, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. A massive wave crashed over the bow, filling the deck with churning water. Rebecca's fingers slipped on the wet railing. She tried to reach for the safety line, but another wave hit before she could secure herself. The world became a confused mess of water and sky, tumbling over and over until she didn't know which way was up. The boat capsized with a sound like thunder. Rebecca found herself underwater, her lungs burning, her mind screaming for air. She kicked hard, breaking the surface just long enough to suck in a desperate breath before another wave pushed her under. Through the chaos, she saw a piece of debris, part of the boat's cabin door, and grabbed it with everything she had. Time lost all meaning. There was only the storm, the waves, and the desperate need to hold on. Her arms ached. Her whole body ached. The cold cut through her like knives, and several times she almost let go, almost surrendered to the pull of the deep water. But something stubborn in her refused to give up. Maybe it was survival instinct. Maybe it was unfinished business. She couldn't tell anymore. At some point during the endless night, the storm began to calm. The waves grew smaller, the wind less fierce. Rebecca's grip on the debris weakened, but somehow she managed to hold on. Her mind drifted between consciousness and something else, somewhere between sleep and death. She thought about her partner, about the dive that went wrong, about all the things she'd never said. When dawn finally came, it came slowly. First, just a lightening of the darkness, then hints of color, pink and orange spreading across the horizon. Rebecca's eyes could barely focus, but she saw something that made her heart leap. Land. A dark shape against the morning sky. An island. The current carried her closer and closer still. She tried to kick, to help herself along, but her legs wouldn't respond properly. The debris bumped against something solid, sand. She'd reached shallow water. Using the last of her strength, Rebecca crawled onto the beach, collapsing face down on white sand that felt impossibly soft after hours in the water. She must have passed out because when she opened her eyes again, the sun was higher and hot against her back. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest as she pushed herself up to sit. Her clothes were torn and stiff with dried salt. Her skin was raw from the sun and sea, but she was alive. The beach stretched in both directions, forming a perfect crescent. Behind it rose dense jungle, thick with vegetation so green it almost hurt to look at. Palm trees swayed in a gentle breeze that seemed impossible after last night's fury. The water lapped peacefully at the shore, looking innocent and calm, as if the storm had been nothing but a bad dream. Rebecca stood on shaky legs and looked around. Scattered along the beach were pieces of the boat, splintered wood, torn fabric, bits of equipment. She found one of her waterproof bags tangled in seaweed. Inside, some supplies had survived. A damaged GPS unit, a waterlogged notebook, some energy bars sealed in plastic. Her radio was destroyed, its screen cracked and dark. No way to call for help. She walked the length of the beach, searching for any sign of Captain Rodriguez, but found nothing. The realization hit her hard. She might be the only survivor. The thought made her sick, but she pushed it down. She couldn't afford to break down. Not yet. First, she needed water, shelter, a plan. As she gathered what supplies she could salvage, something caught her eye near the tree line. Wooden posts, maybe 3 feet tall, arranged in a pattern. She moved closer, squinting in the bright sunlight. The posts were old, weathered gray by sun and salt, but they were definitely man-made. Carved marks covered their surfaces, symbols or letters too worn to read clearly. Rebecca touched one of the posts. The wood was smooth, shaped by human hands. Someone had been here before. Maybe they still were. The thought brought a flicker of hope. If people lived here, she could find them, get help, get home. But as she looked deeper into the jungle, following the line of posts that disappeared into the shadows between the trees, an uneasy feeling settled over her. The posts looked old, very old, and the jungle beyond them was silent in a way that felt wrong. No bird calls, no animal sounds, just the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant rhythm of waves. Rebecca stood at the edge of the beach, caught between the ocean that had nearly killed her and the unknown island that might be her only chance of survival. The carved posts seemed to be marking a path, inviting her forward, or warning her to stay away. She had no choice, really. The island was her home now, at least until someone came looking for her. If anyone came looking at all. Taking a deep breath, Rebecca picked up her salvaged bag and took her first step toward the jungle. The posts stood like silent guardians, keeping their secrets, watching as she passed between them into the green shadows beyond. 2 weeks had passed since the storm, and Rebecca had learned the hard way that survival wasn't like the movies. Her hands were covered in cuts from building a shelter using palm fronds and driftwood. She'd gotten sick twice from eating the wrong berries, and the loneliness was worse than she'd ever imagined. Every morning, she climbed to the highest point on the beach and scanned the horizon for ships or planes. Nothing, just endless water stretching in every direction. She'd tried to calculate her position based on where they'd been traveling before the storm hit, but without working equipment, it was just guesswork. She was probably 50 miles from the nearest inhabited island. Maybe more. The carved wooden posts still bothered her. She'd found more of them leading into the jungle, forming a clear path that went deeper into the island's interior. At first, she'd been too focused on basic survival to explore. But now, with a somewhat stable camp and a system for collecting rainwater, curiosity was eating at her. The sound started on the 16th night. Rebecca was lying in her shelter, listening to the usual nighttime chorus of insects and waves when she heard something different, a pattern, almost like breathing, deep and slow, coming from somewhere in the jungle. It wasn't quite animal and not quite human. The rhythm was too regular, too deliberate. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she called out. "Is someone there?" The sound stopped immediately. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the strange breathing. Rebecca grabbed the makeshift spear she'd fashioned from a tree branch and waited, barely breathing herself. Minutes passed. The normal sounds of the night slowly returned, but sleep didn't come easy after that. The next day, she decided to follow the posts. She needed to know what was on this island. If someone else was here, they could help her. And if they were making those sounds at night, well, she'd rather meet them in daylight. The path wound through dense vegetation that blocked out most of the sun. Vines hung like curtains and roots crossed the trail like obstacles in a maze. Rebecca moved slowly, marking trees as she went so she could find her way back. The carved posts appeared every 100 feet or so, keeping her on track. After an hour of walking, she found something that made her stop dead. A cave entrance half hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss. The opening was large enough to walk through without bending. Someone had clearly used this place before. The ground around the entrance was worn smooth, and more of those carved symbols decorated the rock face. Rebecca hesitated. Every instinct told her caves were dangerous, but the thought of what might be inside pulled at her. Supplies, maybe, or clues about who had been here before. She stepped inside, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness. The cave was larger than she expected, opening into a natural chamber about the size of a small house. Light filtered through cracks in the ceiling, creating pale columns of dusty sunlight, and everywhere she looked there were signs of human habitation. Old tools rusted in corners, pieces of fabric rotted and faded hung from rock protrusions. A makeshift table made from driftwood still stood against one wall. But what caught her attention were the books. Stacks of journals wrapped in layers of plastic bags and old tarp sat on a raised stone shelf. Someone had gone to great lengths to protect them from moisture. Rebecca's hands shook as she reached for the nearest bundle. The plastic crinkled as she unwrapped it, revealing 3 leather-bound notebooks. The first page made her breath catch. Field Journal of Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, March 1987. Rebecca sank onto the cave floor and began to read. Elizabeth had been a botanist, sent to study rare plant species on this island. Her early entries were professional, filled with scientific observations and detailed sketches of flowers and trees. She wrote about the island's unique ecosystem, plants that shouldn't exist together in nature but somehow thrived here. But as weeks turned to months, the entries changed. Elizabeth had come for a 3-month study but got stranded when political unrest closed the region to foreign vessels. No rescue came. She'd been forced to survive alone, just like Rebecca. The handwriting grew more hurried as Rebecca flipped through the pages. Elizabeth wrote about finding the carved posts, following them deeper into the island. She described the sounds at night, the same breathing rhythm Rebecca had heard. "It's not an animal," Elizabeth wrote. "I'm certain now. It's coming from the trees themselves." Rebecca's scientific mind wanted to dismiss it. Trees didn't breathe in a way humans could hear. But she kept reading, unable to stop. Elizabeth had found something in the island's center. She called it the Grove. Her descriptions became almost poetic, talking about ancient trees that seemed aware of her presence. Trees that moved in ways that couldn't be explained by wind. She spent months studying them, taking samples, making observations that grew increasingly unusual. "The locals knew," one entry read. "That's why the island was forbidden, why the posts mark boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, but I've crossed them, and I can't unhear what they're saying." Rebecca flipped faster through the journals, searching for answers. What had Elizabeth discovered? The entries became shorter, more cryptic. The handwriting changed, becoming flowing and artistic, instead of the earlier precise script. The final journal ended abruptly. The last entry was dated December 1993, more than 6 years after Elizabeth had arrived. "I understand now. The island isn't a prison, it's a sanctuary. For the trees, yes, but also for people like me. People who don't fit in the world outside. I'm not leaving. I'm not lost. I'm finally home." That was it. No explanation. No conclusion. Just those final words and empty pages after. Rebecca's mind raced. 6 years. Elizabeth had survived here for 6 years. That meant the island could sustain someone long-term. But where was she now? The journal was more than 30 years old. Had she eventually been rescued? Or a sound from outside the cave made Rebecca freeze, the breathing rhythm. But now it was different. Faster, as if something was excited or agitated. She grabbed the journals and stuffed them back into their protective wrapping, her heart hammering. Slowly, she moved to the cave entrance and peered out. The jungle looked the same as before, green and thick and still. But the sound was closer now, coming from somewhere just beyond the nearest trees. And there was something else. A sweet smell in the air that hadn't been there before. Like flowers, but stronger, almost overwhelming. Rebecca's vision swam. The cave entrance seemed to ripple like water. She stumbled backward, confused. What was happening? Was she sick? Dehydrated? The sweet smell grew stronger, filling her nose and throat. Through her blurring vision, she saw them. The trees at the edge of the clearing, their bark was moving. Not swaying in wind, but pulsing. Like a heartbeat. Like breathing. "This isn't real," she whispered. "This can't be real." But as her legs gave out and darkness crept in from the edges of her vision, Rebecca's last thought was of Elizabeth's final journal entry. The woman hadn't been rescued. She'd chosen to stay. And now Rebecca understood why she'd sounded so certain, so peaceful in those last words. The island was showing her something. Something impossible. Something that would change everything. Rebecca woke up inside the cave, her head pounding like someone had hit her with a hammer. Sunlight streamed through the cracks above. but it looked different now, sharper somehow, more alive. She pushed herself up slowly, trying to remember what had happened. The trees, the breathing, the sweet smell that had knocked her out. She touched her face, half expecting to find herself injured, but her skin felt normal. Actually better than normal. The sunburn that had been plaguing her for days seemed less angry. The cuts on her hands looked days older than they should. How long had she been unconscious? Rebecca stumbled to the cave entrance and froze. The jungle looked the same, but also completely different. She could see details she'd never noticed before. Individual leaves stood out with crystal clarity. The sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance was so clear it might have been right next to her ear. And the smells. She could smell everything. Wet earth, rotting wood, flowers, even the salt from the ocean half a mile away. "What's happening to me?" she whispered. The answer came not in words but in feeling. A sense of connection, like invisible threads linking her to everything around her. The trees weren't just trees anymore. She could feel them, their slow, ancient presence. Their roots spreading underground like a vast network, their leaves drinking in sunlight and turning it into life. This was what Elizabeth had discovered. This was what the journals had been trying to explain in words that couldn't quite capture it. Rebecca's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to walk. She needed to see them up close. The breathing trees. Following the path deeper into the jungle, she noticed things she'd missed before. The way certain plants grew in patterns around the carved posts. How the vines seemed to avoid specific areas, as if respecting invisible boundaries. The island wasn't just wild, it was organized, purposeful. After 20 minutes of walking, the jungle opened up into a clearing, and there they were. The grove. 7 massive trees stood in a rough circle, their trunks wider than any Rebecca had ever seen. Their bark was dark and textured, covered in strange patterns that looked almost like writing, but it was their movement that stole her breath. The bark pulsed, slowly, rhythmically, like breathing, like a heartbeat. She stepped closer, her scientific training warring with what her eyes were telling her. Trees didn't do this, couldn't do this. But as she approached the nearest one, she felt warmth radiating from its trunk. She placed her palm against the bark and the pulse grew stronger under her touch. Images flooded her mind. Not her memories, but someone else's. She saw indigenous people gathered around these same trees, treating them with reverence. Saw colonial ships arriving, soldiers trying to cut into the bark with axes that bounced off like the wood was made of stone. Saw scientists taking samples only to watch them die the moment they left the island. Saw Elizabeth standing exactly where Rebecca stood now, tears running down her face. Rebecca yanked her hand away, gasping. The vision stopped, but the connection remained. She could feel the tree's awareness, not thoughts exactly, but something older and deeper. They knew she was here. They'd known since the moment she washed up on the beach. They'd been waiting. "Why?" she said aloud, feeling foolish for talking to trees but unable to stop herself. "What do you want?" The answer came as a feeling of acceptance, of recognition. The trees didn't want anything from her. They were offering something to her. A choice Elizabeth had been given 30 years ago. Rebecca spent the next 3 days in a fever. She made it back to her shelter but barely remembered the journey. The connection she'd felt at the grove intensified, pulling at her mind even from a distance. She dreamed vivid dreams of the island's history, saw it rising from the ocean millions of years ago, watched the trees grow from seedlings into giants, witnessed countless generations of people who had lived here, protected the grove, and understood its secret. The trees were old, older than they had any right to be, and they released something into the air, a chemical compound that affected human brain chemistry, not a drug or poison, something more subtle. It enhanced perception, created connections between the conscious mind and the natural world around it, made people aware of the vast, silent communication happening between all living things. But it only worked for people who stayed, who gave themselves over to the island completely. Elizabeth had figured it out. That's why she'd stayed. Not because she was trapped, but because leaving would mean losing this expanded awareness. Going back to seeing the world as separate, dead, meaningless. When the fever finally broke, Rebecca felt different. The connection was permanent now. She could feel the grove even from her beach shelter, could sense the network of roots spreading beneath the island, could almost hear the slow conversations between trees, conducted in chemical signals and underground fungal networks. She returned to the cave and read more of Elizabeth's journals with new understanding. The botanist had documented everything. The trees were a unique species, possibly the last of their kind. They'd evolved in isolation, developing this strange symbiotic relationship with humans. The indigenous people who'd lived here had protected them for centuries, understanding instinctively what science was only beginning to discover, that consciousness wasn't limited to animals with brains. That awareness could take forms humans barely understood. Elizabeth had also left something else in the cave, a grave marker. Rebecca found it tucked behind the journals, a simple wooden cross with words burned into the surface. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, 1945-1993, she stayed. Rebecca's hands trembled as she held it. Elizabeth hadn't left the island. She died here by choice. She'd lived for 6 years in harmony with this place, and then, when her time came, she'd accepted it. The island had become her home in a way nowhere else could be. The realization hit Rebecca hard. She sank to the cave floor, the marker still in her hands. Elizabeth had been happy here. The final journals made that clear. She'd found peace, purpose, connection, everything she'd been missing in the outside world. The trees hadn't trapped her. They'd set her free, but what did that mean for Rebecca? She wasn't Elizabeth. She had a life back home, family who would worry, colleagues who might still be searching for her. The guilt about her research partner that had driven her to this remote assignment in the first place. Could she really just let all of that go? She carried the marker outside and followed Elizabeth's instructions from the journals. There was a spot near the grove, a small clearing where flowers grew year-round. Elizabeth had written about wanting to be buried there, close to the trees that had given her so much. Rebecca found the place easily, and she found the grave. Someone had buried Elizabeth here, carefully placing rocks to mark the spot. But who? The island had been uninhabited for decades, unless... She placed the marker at the head of the grave and sat beside it. The breathing rhythm of the grove filled the air, steady and eternal. In that moment, Rebecca understood something Elizabeth's journals had never quite said. The trees themselves had somehow ensured Elizabeth's burial. Through their chemical influence on animals, through the way they shaped the island's ecosystem, they'd made sure she rested here, protected, honored, home. I don't know what to do, Rebecca said to the grave, to the trees, to the island itself. I came here to hide from my mistakes, from the guilt. But this... She gestured at the grove, at the impossible beauty surrounding her. This is bigger than my pain, bigger than one person's story. The trees pulsed in response, their ancient rhythm unchanged. They didn't judge, didn't demand. They simply existed, offering what they'd always offered, a connection to something vast and eternal, a way to be part of the world instead of separate from it. As sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Rebecca made her way back to the beach. Tomorrow, she knew, she would have to decide. The rescue she'd been praying for would come eventually. It always did. And when it came, she would face the same choice Elizabeth had faced, stay or go. Remain connected to this impossible place or return to a world that would never understand. Keep the island's secret or expose it to people who would destroy it trying to possess it. The answer felt both impossibly simple and terrifyingly complex. But for tonight, she simply sat on the beach and watched the stars emerge, feeling the pulse of the grove like a second heartbeat, steady and sure beneath everything else. The helicopter appeared on the 73rd day. Rebecca was gathering coconuts when she heard the distant thump of rotor blades. Her heart jumped into her throat. For 10 weeks she'd been scanning the horizon every morning, hoping for exactly this. But now that the moment was here, she felt paralyzed. She dropped the coconuts and ran to the beach, waving her arms over her head. The helicopter circled once, twice. They'd seen her. After all this time, someone had finally found her. She should have been crying with relief, should have been shouting with joy. Instead, she felt her stomach twist into knots. The pilot's voice crackled through a loudspeaker. "We see you. We're coming down. Stay where you are." Rebecca stood on the beach, her emergency pack already prepared by her shelter. She'd kept it ready for weeks just in case. Inside were the basics she'd salvaged from the shipwreck, some dried food, her ruined GPS, everything she'd need to prove who she was and where she'd come from. But sitting next to the pack were her real treasures. Elizabeth's journals, samples from the grove, flowers, leaves, even a small cutting from one of the ancient trees. Documentation that would revolutionize everything scientists thought they knew about plant consciousness and human-nature symbiosis. The helicopter began its descent, sand whipping into clouds around the beach. Rebecca shielded her eyes, watching it come closer. This was it. Her ticket home. Back to hot showers and real food and people. Back to her apartment, her career, her old life. The life she'd been running from. Her hand moved to touch the carved post at the jungle's edge. Through her enhanced connection, she could feel the grove's presence even from here. The trees were aware. They knew what was happening. And they were calm, patient. They'd waited millions of years. They could wait longer, but could she? The helicopter touched down, and a man in a flight suit jumped out, ducking under the still spinning blades. He jogged toward her, relief clear on his face. "Rebecca Chen?" He shouted over the noise. She nodded, unable to find her voice. "Thank God, we've been searching for weeks. Are you injured? Can you walk?" "I'm fine," she managed to say. "I can walk. Good, we need to go now. Weather's turning again. Grab your things." Rebecca looked at her emergency pack, then at the samples sitting beside it, then at the jungle behind her where the grove waited, where Elizabeth rested, where she'd spent the last 2 months becoming someone completely different from the woman who'd washed up on this beach. The pilot was already heading back to the helicopter, expecting her to follow. Rebecca picked up her emergency pack. Her legs felt heavy as she took a step toward the aircraft. Then another. The rotor wash pushed against her like the island itself was trying to hold her back. She stopped halfway across the beach. What would happen if she brought those samples back? Scientists would come, researchers like she used to be, excited and ambitious and hungry for discovery. They'd study the trees, take more samples, run experiments, and when they couldn't recreate the effect in labs, they'd bring the trees back, cut them down, destroy the grove trying to understand it. Or worse, they'd turn the island into a research station. Tourists would come. Companies would fight for access. The grove that had existed in peace for millions of years would become just another resource to exploit. Just another wonder destroyed by people who wanted to own what they should have protected. Rebecca thought about her research partner, the dive that went wrong. She'd spent 3 years believing it was her fault, that her ambition had killed someone she cared about. But now she understood something deeper. The real tragedy wasn't the accident. It was how humans approached the natural world. Always taking, always trying to control and possess instead of simply being present. The grove had taught her that. Elizabeth had understood it. And now Rebecca had to decide if she was brave enough to honor that understanding. She turned back toward her camp. The samples sat there looking innocent in the afternoon light. Knowledge that could change the world, or destroy this island trying. The pilot appeared beside her, concern on his face. "Ma'am, we really need to go. The storm system is moving in fast." Rebecca looked at him. He was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes. Just doing his job, trying to save her. He had no idea what he'd be taking from this place if she left with those samples. No idea what she'd become in her time here. "Give me 1 minute," she said. "I need to get something from my shelter." He nodded, glancing nervously at the darkening sky. 1 minute. That's all we have." Rebecca walked to her camp, moving deliberately. She picked up Elizabeth's journals first. These were history, proof that someone else had been here, had made the same choice Rebecca was about to make. She wrapped them carefully in waterproof material and placed them back in the cave where she'd found them. Let them stay. Let the next person who needed them find them the same way she had. Then she took the samples. The flowers, the leaves, the cutting from the ancient tree. She carried them to the edge of the grove, moving quickly. The trees pulsed in greeting, their rhythm matching her own heartbeat now. She buried the samples at the base of the largest tree, pressing the earth down firmly. "I understand," she whispered. "I understand what you are, what you offer, and I understand why it has to stay secret. The sweet smell surrounded her, that chemical compound that had changed everything. The trees weren't trying to trap her. They were simply being themselves, offering connection to anyone willing to stay long enough to receive it. Elizabeth had stayed, had chosen this place over everything else, had died happy and at peace, connected to something vast and eternal. Rebecca's hands shook as she stood. She had her emergency pack. She had her story about surviving a shipwreck. She had nothing that would lead anyone back to the Grove's secret. The pilot was calling to her now, urgent. The wind was picking up. She could see dark clouds building on the horizon. Another storm coming. The island's way of protecting itself, maybe, or just the weather doing what weather does. She walked back to the beach, every step feeling like a betrayal and a blessing at the same time. The helicopter's blades were spinning faster, ready to lift off. The pilot helped her inside, securing her harness with practiced efficiency. "You're lucky," he shouted over the noise. "Most people don't survive this long alone." Rebecca looked out the window as they lifted off. The beach grew smaller beneath them. The jungle became a green blur. She could still feel the grove, that connection pulling at her like a rubber band stretching to its limit. But she could already feel it fading. Distance weakened it. Time would erase it completely. The island shrank to a dark spot in the endless blue ocean. From up here, it looked like any other uninhabited island. Nothing special, nothing worth investigating, just another piece of land in a vast and empty sea. What was it like? The pilot asked, his voice tinny through the headset. Being alone for so long? Rebecca watched the island disappear into the distance. What could she say? That she'd found trees that breathed? That she'd connected with something ancient and impossible? That she'd been offered a choice to leave humanity behind and had almost taken it? "Quiet," she said finally. It was quiet. The pilot nodded, satisfied with the answer. He didn't need to know more. Nobody did. The island would keep its secret. The grove would continue its ancient existence. And Elizabeth would rest in peace, her choice honored by someone who understood. But as the helicopter carried her back to civilization, back to the world of noise and people and endless busyness, Rebecca touched her chest. The connection was fading, but not gone. She could still feel an echo of it, a memory of belonging to something bigger than herself. She'd saved the island by leaving it, but she'd left part of herself behind in that grove. And she knew with absolute certainty that she would carry that loss for the rest of her life. Some prices were worth paying. Some secrets were worth keeping, even when it hurt. 5 years later, Rebecca stood at the window of her small apartment in Seattle, watching rain streak down the glass. The city hummed below, alive with traffic and voices and the constant buzz of modern life. She'd been back in civilization for exactly 5 years, 2 months and 17 days. Not that she was counting. Her phone buzzed. Another interview request from a marine biology podcast. They wanted to hear about her survival story, how she'd lasted 73 days on an uninhabited island. She'd told the story so many times it felt like a script now. The storm, the wreck, building shelter, finding food, collecting rainwater, waiting for rescue. A tale of human resilience and luck. She never mentioned the grove. Never spoke about Elizabeth or the breathing trees or the connection that had changed everything. Those secrets stayed locked inside her, growing heavier with each passing year. Rebecca declined the interview and set her phone down. She'd built a decent life since coming back. Teaching position at the university. Published papers on coral reef restoration. Even started speaking to her family again. On paper, everything looked fine. But the truth was harder to explain. She felt hollow. Like she'd left the most important part of herself on that island and spent every day since trying to remember what it felt like to be whole. Her research had shifted after the rescue. She'd thrown herself into conservation work, fighting to protect marine ecosystems from development and exploitation. Her colleagues thought it was because of her survival experience, a newfound appreciation for nature. They weren't wrong, exactly, but they didn't understand the real reason. She was trying to save other places the way she'd saved the island, trying to protect secrets that couldn't be put into words or captured in photographs, trying to honor Elizabeth's choice by making sure other wild spaces survived. But it wasn't enough. It never felt like enough. The connection had faded within weeks of leaving the island, just as she'd known it would. But she still dreamed about it. The pulse of the trees, the sense of belonging to something vast and eternal. the feeling that she was exactly where she needed to be. She'd wake up reaching for it, only to find herself alone in her small bed, surrounded by walls and silence and the artificial glow of streetlights through her curtains. Her therapist said she was processing trauma. That isolation did strange things to the human mind, that what she remembered probably wasn't real, just her brain's way of coping with the fear and loneliness of being stranded. Rebecca let her believe that. It was easier than the truth. On the 5th anniversary of her rescue, Rebecca received an email that changed everything. It was from a young woman named Keiko, a marine archaeologist who'd been doing research in the Philippines. She'd heard about Rebecca's survival story and wanted to ask some questions about the island's location. "I was documenting historical shipwrecks in the region," the email read, "and I found references to an island that matches your description. Local fishermen warned me away from it, said it was forbidden. But my boat got caught in a storm anyway, and I washed up there 3 days ago. I found something strange. A cave with old journals. They belonged to someone named Elizabeth Morrison. Do you know anything about this?" Rebecca's hands shook as she read. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The island. Someone else had found it. Found Elizabeth's journals. Found the cave. She typed a response with trembling fingers. "Are you still on the island? Are you safe?" The reply came hours later. "Yes, I'm okay. Found shelter. Plenty of food and water. But there's something weird about this place. The trees make sounds at night. And there are these carved posts leading into the jungle. I followed them today and found..." The email trailed off, unfinished. Rebecca stared at her screen, knowing exactly what Keiko had found. The grove. The breathing trees. The same choice Elizabeth had faced. The same choice Rebecca had run from. Over the next week, she exchanged daily emails with Keiko. The young woman described everything. The pulsing bark. The sweet smell. The visions and dreams. The growing sense of connection. She sounded exactly like Elizabeth's journals. Excited, confused, transformed. "I don't understand what's happening to me," Keiko wrote. "But I feel more alive here than I ever have. Like I can finally see clearly. Does that sound crazy?" Rebecca knew she should tell Keiko to signal for rescue immediately. Should warn her about what staying would mean. But when she tried to type those words, her fingers wouldn't cooperate. Because she remembered. She remembered how it felt to be connected to something that vast and ancient. How it felt to finally understand her place in the world. Who was she to take that away from someone else? "Listen carefully," Rebecca wrote back. "Elizabeth Morrison was a real person. She stayed on that island for 6 years by choice. She's buried near the grove. The trees are real. What you're feeling is real. But you need to understand something. If you stay, you can't come back. Not really. You'll lose that connection the moment you leave, and you'll spend the rest of your life missing it. I know because I made the choice to go, and I've regretted it every single day since." She hit send before she could change her mind. Keiko's response came the next morning. "A rescue boat is coming tomorrow. They tracked my emergency beacon. I have maybe 12 hours to decide. What should I do?" Rebecca stood from her desk and walked to her window. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming. Somewhere down there, people were living their lives. Working, laughing, loving, struggling, connected to each other in 1,000 different ways. It was beautiful in its own right, meaningful, real, but it wasn't the grove. She thought about Elizabeth, buried on that island, at peace. She thought about the connection she'd felt, the sense of purpose and belonging. She thought about the 5 years she'd spent feeling like half a person, pretending the world made sense when she knew it didn't. "I can't make this choice for you," Rebecca typed. "Elizabeth chose to stay. I chose to leave. Both choices have costs. If you stay, you'll protect something ancient and irreplaceable. You'll be connected to life in a way most people never experience. But you'll give up everything else. Your career, your family, the future you planned. If you leave, you'll save the island's secret. But you'll carry the weight of that loss forever. There's no right answer, Keiko. Only what you can live with." 2 days passed with no response. Then a week. Then a month. Rebecca checked her email obsessively, but nothing came. She searched news reports for rescued archaeologists in the Philippines. Nothing. She contacted the Coast Guard, claiming to have information about a missing researcher. They told her no one matching Keiko's description had been reported missing or rescued in that region. Finally, Rebecca understood. Keiko had made her choice. The same choice Elizabeth had made 30 years before. The island had its new guardian. The grove would be protected for another generation, and Rebecca would carry that knowledge alone, the way she'd carried Elizabeth's secret. Two women who'd found something impossible and chosen to stay. While she had found it and walked away, some nights she still dreamed about the island. About the breathing trees and the sense of connection. About Elizabeth's grave and the journals in the cave. About a young archaeologist standing where she'd once stood, making a different choice, a braver choice. Rebecca returned to her work with renewed purpose. She couldn't go back, couldn't reclaim what she'd lost. But she could honor it. She could fight to protect the wild spaces that remained, knowing that some of them held secrets worth dying for, worth living for. She never heard from Keiko again. But sometimes, late at night, she imagined her there on the island, walking among the ancient trees, feeling their pulse, understanding finally what it meant to be truly home. And in those moments, Rebecca's choice to leave didn't feel like running away anymore. It felt like passing on a gift she wasn't brave enough to keep. It felt like making sure the island would never be alone. The grove would survive. The secret would be kept. And somewhere in the vast blue ocean, on an island most people would never find, life continued its ancient rhythm, patient, eternal, waiting for the next person who needed what it offered. Rebecca touched her chest, feeling for that old connection. It was gone now, faded completely, but the memory remained. And sometimes she thought memory was enough. It had to be, because some choices once made couldn't be undone. You just had to learn to live with them, and she was trying. Every day she was trying.